Hello. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's session on Making Learning Visible, the Power of Teacher Clarity. This is session 1 of 2. In this session, we're going to discuss the fundamental components that make up teacher clarity. My name is Melissa Jones. I am a teacher quality specialist for the West Region in the Muskogee County School District. Please feel free to jot down my email address and reach out to me with any questions, concerns, or support that you may need. Before we jump into the content, let's take a moment to connect. Even though we aren't physically in the same room together, please take a moment to respond to one of the following prompts. Prompt A, how do you start your day? Prompt B, what is your favorite thing to do on a long road trip? Prompt C, what do you do to relax? In today's session, we're going to focus on the following learning intentions. The goal is that you understand the 4 components of teacher clarity, that you understand the criteria for each component, and that you are able to implement each component into your classroom. At the end of today's session, you will be able to describe the components of teacher clarity and identify at least one component that you plan to focus on in your classroom. Think about what teacher clarity means to you. What does it look like? What does it feel like in your classroom? Today, we're going to start with what teacher clarity is. What are some key components of teacher clarity? We will discuss each component, starting with the clarity of organization, the clarity of explanation, the clarity of examples and guided practice, the clarity of assessment, and then in session 2, we will discuss the teacher clarity playbook. So what does clarity mean? By definition, clarity is the quality of being clear, easily understood, or having a full, detailed grasp of something. So when we talk about teacher clarity, we're talking about the teacher's ability to be clear, to be easily understood, and to have a full, detailed grasp of something. That something being the goal of the lesson, the learning intention, the success criteria that students will meet to demonstrate mastery of that learning intention, and each of the components that will contribute to student success. So, what is teacher clarity? Teacher clarity is something that helps us make informed decisions about the teaching and learning that's happening within our classrooms. It demands that we keep the big picture in mind, that as the teacher, we remain focused on what students must understand, demonstrate, and be able to do. It allows us to integrate teaching and learning practices at the right time for the students that we serve. It also gives us evidence as to what we must teach in order for our students to learn. According to John Hattie, teacher clarity has an effect size of 0.75. John Hattie's research identifies that an instructional strategy with an effect size of 0.4 or higher will demonstrate or at least indicate 1 year of growth in terms of students' outcomes. So when we look at teacher clarity and we see that it has an effect size of 0.75, what that translates to is an understanding that if teachers implement the components of teacher clarity within their classrooms, that we will see a growth or an increase in student outcomes equivalent to almost 2 years of growth. So, what are the key components? The key components are clarity of organization, clarity of explanation, clarity of examples and guided practice, and clarity of assessment. Let's start with clarity of organization. For clarity of organization, I want you to think about not just the physical environment or organization of your classroom, but also the sequence of learning. How have you organized the physical space, the desks, the chairs, the bookcases, the tables? How are the materials organized and managed for students to easily access and use? How do students transition from one area in your classroom to another? Have you established clear rituals and routines that help the flow of your classroom move smoothly? When we think about the sequence of learning, we're talking about the instructional design of the lesson. How is the lesson set up to allow students to progress from simple concepts to more complex concepts? Have we intentionally thought about how we're going to scaffold student practice? Are we implementing components or utilizing components of the gradual release? Is there an I do, a we do, and a you do to successfully transfer the cognitive load from the teacher to the student? Do students have opportunities to respond as well as receive feedback? And are our goals clearly aligned to the standard? Some questions to consider when you're thinking about clarity of organization. Is the lesson structure clear to students? Are transitions and expectations explicit? It is very important that when we think about clarity of organization, that we think about what students will need in order to make sure they are successful when it comes to the particular learning target and or standard. The things or the characteristics that students need to be successful are the things that we must consider prior to teaching the lesson. We must ensure that those components are embedded within the lesson so that students will achieve the desired outcomes. Let's talk about clarity of explanation. When it comes to clarity of explanation, we want to make sure that there's a balance between what students already know or their prior knowledge, what we may need to review or make sure that they have a solid understanding of, and then how do we challenge students to apply the information that they are learning? We also must be cognizant of our blind spots as teachers. Our familiarity with the content can sometimes create blind spots for us, where we underestimate how long it's going to take students to complete the task. We may also fail to recognize the steps that students need in order to be successful on a particular task. Sometimes we may have to break components down into manageable chunks, smaller bite sized pieces that will make it easier for students to grasp the concept. Here are some additional reasons for teacher blind spots. While we have already talked about underestimating how long it may take students to complete the task, we also sometimes fail to predict where students are going to have trouble. If we can identify components that may confuse students or that students may easily misunderstand, then we can go ahead and build specific practices and specific opportunities for students to practice that particular concept to reduce the chance of them having trouble with it as we move forward. Sometimes we underestimate or overestimate how much students can handle. Sometimes we say, that's too much for them. My students can't do that. They're not on that level. As educators, we must make sure that we have provided students with the necessary steps that they need to understand the content. If we embed the necessary steps, the necessary scaffolds, the necessary practices for students to master a concept, then we will help overcome many of these teacher blind spots. Some other ways to avoid teacher blind spots are by pacing and reinforcing student learning, making sure that we do not oversimplify, and setting high expectations. The difference between your high expectations and your low expectations is shown on the slide. A high expectation is that we expect students to succeed. A low expectation is that we offer less demanding work because we think that students can't handle work that is on the grade level or on standard. A low expectation is oversimplifying the lesson. Oftentimes, teachers tell themselves, I've got to give it to my students on a level that they understand. I have to break it down for my students so that they're able to understand. While providing scaffolds and supports for students is very important, what we do not want to do is oversimplify the lesson or teach students below the standard. A high expectation is that we provide challenging tasks and high quality feedback for students to support their learning throughout each concept. This feedback portion is very important. I once heard a wise man say that if someone just put keys in my hand, put me in a car, and told me to start driving, I would have no clue what to do. But if someone puts keys in my hands, puts me in a car, and provides feedback to tell me what I'm doing correctly and what I may need to tweak, then the chances of me becoming a better driver and a safe driver will increase. This is what we must do for our students. We cannot lower the expectations. We must maintain our high expectations, but we must also make sure that we utilize strategies, scaffolds, and supports to ensure that our students can reach those expectations. Something to consider is, are the explanations I give broken into manageable chunks and accessible to all learners? The next component we're going to talk about is clarity of examples and guided practice. When we talk about clarity of examples and guided practice, we're talking about what students do with the information that they are learning. This is what students will usually do when they are processing the information. There are various instructional strategies and techniques that can be used during this particular portion of your class. But what I want to pull your attention to is how we use examples and how we use guided practice. When using examples help to reduce the cognitive load for our students. It helps to show our students exactly what it is that we are asking them to do. It takes the guessing out of it. Students don't have to try to figure out if they're doing the right thing. They don't have to try to guess if this is what you're asking. If we can provide examples for students, that will help support our students' reasoning and critical thinking so that they can apply their learning. Using non-examples is something that we don't see educators use as often. Using non-examples is just as powerful as examples. Non-examples help students identify or distinguish between similar or related concepts. It helps them understand what is expected and what is not. It also ensures that what students produce is going to be up to the level of the standard, it's going to meet the teacher expectations, and we can gradually increase the level of complexity as our students master what we're asking them to do. Now let's discuss how you can use examples in your classroom. When using examples, think about making examples and non-examples relevant. Select examples and non-examples that students can identify with. Scaffold your examples. Build and gradually increase the complexity of the examples until you reach the level of the standard. Make sure that you discuss with students the characteristics of the examples and the non-examples to better help students identify what it is you need them to do. Consider, are the examples that you use relevant and clear? And is there a sufficient guided practice for students before they are asked to demonstrate mastery on a skill or a concept? Now let's discuss clarity of assessment. I know when you hear the word assessment, you probably thought, oh my gosh. But don't feel that way about assessment. Assessment is simply a systematic process for gathering evidence. We can do that through a variety of tools. It doesn't always have to be a test or a quiz. So, when we talk about assessment today, we're going to talk about how we gather evidence, how we interpret that evidence, and then how we use that evidence. Because that's what assessments are used to do. They're used to provide us with evidence that helps us to understand where our students are. Consider what evidence you can obtain that does not come from a test, a quiz, or a formal assessment. What conversations are you having with your students that helps you to understand where they are in their learning? What conversations are students having with each other that helps you understand where their misconceptions may be or where their level of mastery lies? How can you intentionally incorporate more opportunities to gather evidence about where your students are and what level they are on when it comes to understanding or mastering the concept or standard? If we start to think about assessments as tools for gathering evidence, and we help our students understand that assessments are tools for gathering evidence, then we'll begin to not only gather better evidence, but we'll begin to use the evidence that we're gathering. Based on what you now know about teacher clarity, what does teacher clarity look like now? What have you learned about the four components of teacher clarity? How can you apply what you have learned about the four components of teacher clarity to your classroom? Remember, teacher clarity helps us to reduce student frustration. It helps students to know exactly what they are doing and why. If students understand the goal, then they are more likely to work toward reaching it. When we think about clarity of organization, remember, what is one ritual or routine that you could start tomorrow to make transitions clearer, to make expectations clearer inside your classroom? Perhaps your students have a hard time working in groups. What processes or procedures can you put in place to help your students work more productively during this time? When you think about clarity of explanation, what is it that students don't know? What are some steps that you may need to take to ensure that students reach the level of understanding that is needed? Are you breaking the lesson down into smaller parts? Are you looking at what students are being asked to do and working with them in order to accomplish that goal? Are the examples and guided practice that you provide helping students to understand what right looks like and what wrong looks like, what meeting the expectation looks like, and what not meeting the expectation looks like? To be able to identify and critically evaluate what is missing or the error that has been made in a mathematical problem. Students having the opportunity to work through these scenarios and to understand clearly what is being asked helps to ensure that our students are clear about their learning targets. And when it comes to assessments, if assessments are tools for gathering evidence, what are some ways that you can gather evidence in your classroom without using a test or a quiz? Remember, your assessments should tell you whether or not your students are ready to move on, whether or not you need to reteach a concept, or whether or not they need additional practice or time. Now that we have discussed teacher clarity and the four components, before our next meeting, I want you all to select one component that you will focus on over the next week. Take note of your current practices as they relate to this component. What can you do to improve this component within your classroom? And what are some things that you are doing that you want to continue doing within this component in your classroom? Make sure that you are ready to discuss the component you identified and how you focused on that component during the upcoming week at our next session. Our next session will take place on Wednesday, January 28th. We will meet at the Fort Learnatorium at Fort Middle School. I can't wait to hear about your focus area and what you have seen in your classroom as you reflect on these four components of teacher clarity. Prior to our next session, please complete the feedback survey that you see on the screen. And again, if you need to contact me, my name is Melissa Jones. I'm the Teacher Quality Specialist for the West Region, and my contact information is on the screen. Have a wonderful day.